Welcome back to Von Tolstat Fight Club. In this series, we look at rapier techniques based on historical sources from the late 16th and early 17th centuries, mixed with practical application from modern fight experience in tournaments and sparring. As always, these are not the only techniques out there, but we pressure test them and find them highly effective against non-compliant opponents. In today's episode, we'll examine one of the most commonly performed and possibly most misunderstood techniques in all of fencing, the Cavazione, or what we commonly call in modern terms, the disengage. In the most basic terms, a Cavazione is a change of line either from the high outside to the high inside or the high inside to the high outside, performed by dipping the tip of your sword under the opponent's blade and coming up on the other side. A lot of people have opinions on the best and most proper way to Cavazione, but I'm going to tell you right now, there is no one right way to do this, and in fact, you will need to perform it in different ways depending on what is happening in the action of combat. Rather than a really specific technical description, I will mostly offer you some guidelines and principles for the Cavazione. Nevertheless, generally speaking, in order to perform a Cavazione, you will relax your fingers or wrists in order to let the point dip down. I do not force the tip down or push it, I let gravity do the work as I ease up on my grip with my fingers or relax my wrist. I complete the motion by tightening the fingers or wrist to bring the point back up on the other side of my opponent's sword. The idea here is to make the motion only as tight around the opponent's sword as needed to clear it. I'm not sweeping in an unnecessarily wide arc. That said, there are occasions where my Cavazione needs to be wider. For instance, if I'm using a half Cavazione at a closer measure to get around my opponent's hilt. This is not the tight quick disengage I would perform closer to my opponent's tip or mid-blade. Basically, you want your Cavazione to be as wide as needed to clear whatever obstacle your point needs to get around in order to be free and get to its target, but no more than that. Because of this, you'll want to practice both tight quick disengages and wider ones for clearing different obstacles. Further, a more neutrally positioned blade can perform a Cavazione easier and faster than an angled blade. Let's talk about why and when you need to use a Cavazione. There are a lot of fencers who constantly Cavazione in order to try and fake out or confuse their opponent as they approach the measure. Mind you, I'm not talking about attacking from a Cavazione, but simply changing lines over and over to try and juke out the opponent. I advocate against doing this because every Cavazione out of tempo provides an opportunity for your opponent to gain an advantage or to hit you. One of the best uses of the Cavazione is when your opponent comes to gain your blade. As my opponent reaches toward my sword with his, I Cavazione and gain his blade on the opposite side as I come up, closing the line and gaining his sword. As I gain this new advantage, I can go ahead and step forward and thrust in opposition. For more details on how to perform the basic thrusts in opposition, Check out episodes 3, 4, and 5 for proper form and technique. Let's see another example. In this situation, I step into measure as I gain, and my opponent gives lateral pressure to try and regain the line. In order to deal with this, I cavazione and thrust in opposition on the opposite side at the same time that he makes his press, passing my back foot forward to complete the action. I step into measure with my front foot as I gain his blade, and then as he presses, I dip my sword under and pass with my back foot in order to hit him. The reason I'm using a passing step in this situation is because it's much faster than if I gathered my back foot up and took another standard fencing step or lunge. Let's examine another crucial point, the relationship between the tip of my blade and the hilt of my opponent's blade. For the previous two examples, my point had not yet passed my opponent's hilt in quillins. This allows me to use a full cavazione, as it is quick enough to go around my opponent's blade in the time that they press. If you find yourself with your tip past the opponent's hilt, then a full cavazione, one that goes all the way from one high line to the other, is not advisable, because the time it takes to get around the entire hilt is too long of a tempo. I cannot clear the distance around his hilt in the time of his press before he can recover from his first motion, the press itself, and start a new motion to hit me. In this situation, I will instead perform a half cavazione and thrust him under his sword as he presses, going around half of his hilt. I can do a half cavazione around the hilt in about the same amount of time that I can perform a full cavazione around just the blade, and at this distance I can go ahead and hit my opponent as I step off the line with my back foot, passing it forward to my left side in the same time that he gives pressure laterally. My offhand comes up to make a wall against his blade coming back to harm me. Another point that should be noted, when you cavazione, it is a good idea to try and gain an advantage as you finish. Watch here as I close the line with my cavazione. My tip crosses up and over my opponent's sword with more of my blade past theirs, putting me in a stronger position than them when I finish the cavazione. And see here as I step in to gain my opponent's blade as I cavazione. Remember that doing cavazione just because is an opportunity for your opponent to gain an advantage or hit you. Be deliberate and have a plan with your disengages. In that same vein, you never want to perform a cavazione in measure without your opponent giving you a tempo to do so, such as lateral pressure. If you disengage in measure out of tempo, your opponent can easily hit you while your tip is down. If you find you need to free your point while in measure, step out of measure as you perform a half or full cavazione to free your point. So let's recap. In order to perform a cavazione, relax your fingers or wrists to let gravity pull the tip down, and then tighten to pull the tip back up. The best times to use a cavazione is during an opponent's attempt to gain your sword or to give you lateral pressure. The most effective cavazione happens at the same time your opponent is taking an action, such as a gain or press. This is called a cavazione in tempo because it happens while your opponent is taking an action. Never ever stand in measure and perform a cavazione for no reason, or without an action from your opponent that allows you to perform the cavazione at the same time as their action. If your opponent has already gained your blade and is in measure to hit you, you need to get out of measure in order to free your point safely, or perform a different defensive action. If your point is in front of the opponent's hilt, you can perform a full cavazione. If your point is past their hilt, a full cavazione is not feasible, and a half cavazione with a step-off line and thrust is best. These are not the only times to use a cavazione, and are not the only types of cavazione that exist. but these are the foundational principles of how they work and the best times to employ them. Practice these with an opponent who offers different types of pressure at different measures and try to gain an advantage as you Cavazione and half Cavazione. In upcoming episodes, we will break down the mechanics of some of the more advanced actions that come from the Cavazione, as well as break down further some of the actions that we discussed here. Until then, thanks for stopping by. We'll see you next time on Von Tolstat Fight Club.